Hey everybody, you're about to watch my lecture on effective quotation and paraphrasing techniques. Now, these are really important ideas for your academic summary and response essay. They're actually important ideas for almost all academic writing. So it's very important that you pay attention to the points raised in the lecture. I do want to warn you, though, that this particular lecture was actually made a couple of years ago. So the article that this lecture is going to talk about and going to refer to is not the same article that we're reading for class. It's not the data deluge. It's a different article altogether. And that's okay. The ideas of quotation and paraphrase are still the same. It's just that the example sentences will be taken from this other article. I shouldn't want to confuse you when you heard me refer in the lecture to the article being assigned in class. Anyway, please watch the lecture and then complete the material online that follows it. If you have any questions, let me know. Thanks.
One thing that makes academic writing different from either personal writing or public writing is its heavy reliance on the use of source material. I also find this is one of the aspects of academic writing that is most challenging for students, for a variety of reasons. For one thing, the sources that you look at in academic writing tend to be difficult sources. The reading tends to be difficult. You've already read, I hope, Paul Kennedy's article on the decline of America, and some of you may have found that article relatively difficult, even though it's fairly short. So that's one thing that makes academic writing and academic use of source material difficult. But another thing is that academic writing has pretty high standards for how source material is used. And it's the use of source material that I find tends to give students problems. So this lecture is designed to help you understand the appropriate ways to use source material in your own writing. And there are basically just two ways that you can use source material in your own writing, at least two appropriate ways to use it. You can either quote the material directly, or you can paraphrase it. Some people would say that there are three ways: quotation, paraphrase, and summarizing. But summarizing is really just paraphrasing plus, I guess, paraphrasing that also is interested in condensing at the same time. But generally speaking, you're either going to be taking quotations directly from your source, or you're going to be putting the information from the source in your own words, which is paraphrasing. But even though that sounds pretty simple, I find that there are often a lot of misunderstandings about both quotation and paraphrase among student writers. So I think it pays to look at these two kinds of source use and try to understand specifically what the requirements are for each of them. First of all, let's look at quotation. Quotation, as I know all of you know already, simply means taking the exact words from the source that you're using. But I think we need to be careful about how we use that definition. We need to look at the phrasing of the definition to understand how quotation works. Quotation is the exact words of a source. First of all, you can't make changes to quotations. You can't get pretty close to the quotation. You have to quote exactly. I often tell students, quotation doesn't just mean taking the material word for word. It means taking it letter for letter. It means taking it space for space and punctuation mark for punctuation mark. It means as much as possible, as closely as possible, representing the passage in question exactly as it appeared in the original source. Quotation has to be so exact that, in fact, if you find a mistake in a quotation, if, for example, the source that you're using misspells a word, when you quote that source, you have to misspell that word also. And there are ways to sort of mark that as what you're doing, but you can't make changes to a quotation to make it more correct. You certainly can't be sloppy about quotation. So quotation is actually a fairly demanding use of sources, because you have to pay very close attention, or at least you used to have to pay very close attention with copy and paste, and so many of the sources you'll use now are online sources. It's a lot easier to get the source exactly as it was intended in the original. But that's the key to quotation. It has to be exactly the words and the ideas of the original source. So what's paraphrasing then? Well, students will often tell me that paraphrasing means rewording the source, and you'll find that I won't use that word. Rewording, I think, is a very dangerous term to use in place of paraphrasing. I like to use a more precise definition. Paraphrasing means expressing the ideas of your source accurately and completely, but in your words instead of the words used in the source. Now, the reason that I like that precise definition better than a term like rewording is that paraphrasing isn't about changing words. It's certainly not about just reorganizing the sentence. And sometimes I see examples of that where a student has taken a sentence or more from an original source and simply sort of rearranged the terms in the sentence. It also doesn't mean replacing individual words with other words. Occasionally I see a technique that I sometimes call thesaurusizing, where you take a sentence and find 5 or 6 keywords in it and replace those keywords with synonyms. That's not paraphrasing either. And in fact, when you look at those kinds of examples, you can tell that it's not paraphrasing because the sentence looks almost exactly like it did in the original. Paraphrasing really means processing the information that you read. In other words, you read a source, you think about what it means, and then creating from scratch a new way of expressing that information, a way that is yours rather than the source's. In other words, the words, the phrasing, the structure of the sentence, all of that needs to come from you rather than coming from the original source. All right, well, those are the 2 ways to use sources, and they're pretty straightforward. What's really dangerous, in my opinion, is the big space between quoting and paraphrasing. If quotation means using the exact words of the source, and paraphrasing means using entirely your words to express the ideas of a source, there's a lot of space between those 2 terms and a lot of room for error in the middle. And often what I see is students falling into that middle area and producing what I made up this word, but producing what can only be termed quota phrasing, where it's sort of quotation, sort of paraphrasing, but as a result, it's neither. It doesn't meet the standards for either quotation or paraphrase. Let's look at an example from the article that you're reading right now. I've taken this passage from the very end of Paul Kennedy's article, and it reads, and this is about America and its position in the world, obviously. Kennedy says, quote, "It will return from being an oversized world power to being a big nation, but one which needs to be listened to, and one which, for the next stretch, is the only country that can supply powerful heft to places in trouble. It will still be really important, but less so than it was." Now, you probably understand those sentences without much difficulty. They're pretty clear, pretty straightforward sentences. You might be tempted to just quote those sentences if you were trying to respond to the ideas in them. And you could quote them as long as you quoted accurately. That would be fine in the response section of your summary and response paper anyway. That would be fine. I'd rather you avoid quotations in the summary part if possible. And really, to be honest, I'd rather you avoid quotations unless they're necessary throughout your writing. Quotations are easily overused. Students like quotations because they're easy. You can just cut and paste, put them in the paper. They take up space. That's if you have a 25-word quotation, that's 25 words you don't have to write. So they're popular for those reasons, but quotations really should only be used when there's a reason to quote. When, in other words, the words are important, not just the ideas. If you're just trying to get the idea of the source into your paper, then it usually works much better to paraphrase than to quote. For one thing, paraphrasing requires that you understand the original passage, because to put something into your own words, you have to understand what it means first. Quotation, you don't have to do that, and every now and then I see examples of quotation where it's pretty clear the author hasn't really paid much attention to what the sentence said or what the passage in question has said, and as a result, they use the quotation in ways that don't really make sense or don't match what the quotation says. So, if possible, it'd probably be preferable to paraphrase this passage, those 2 sentences. But you want to avoid a paraphrase that ends up looking like this, and I'll put them both here on the screen so you can see the comparison. Sometimes I see paraphrases that look like this one. America will go back to being a big country instead of an oversized one, but it will still need to be listened to, and will still be able to supply powerful help to places in danger. It will be less important, but it will still be very important. Now, if you looked at those 2 sentences, they're certainly not exactly the same. It's not a quotation by any means. In fact, there are only a handful of words, individual words, that appear in both sentences. If you look at the first phrase, for example, the original says, "It will return from being an oversized world power to being a big nation." this attempt at paraphrasing says America will go back to being a big country instead of an oversized one. Really, the only words that appear in both passages are being, big, and oversized. Otherwise, all the words are different. But I think you can also tell that this sentence is really just a slightly altered version of the original sentence. In fact, we see both attempts at covering up quota phrasing in this passage. So we see in the first sentence of the attempted paraphrase, we see the author replacing individual words with other words that mean the same thing. So the original source said, it will return from being an oversized world power to being a big nation. Now we have America will go back to being a big country instead of a big nation. So we've used a synonym there. And instead of America being the only country that can supply powerful heft to places in trouble, we have America will be able to supply powerful help to places in danger. There's only a couple of words that have been replaced there, and certainly replacing heft with help and trouble with danger is not really paraphrasing. This is simply, rewording the sentence. This is simply taking a sentence that another author has written, presenting it as your own, and just changing some of the original words. We also see the other technique in that second sentence, whereas the Kennedy's original sentence said it will still be really important, but less so than it was. This author has tried to switch things around and say it will be less important, but it will still be very important. So we see rearranging as a strategy here. And neither replacing words with other words or rearranging the structure of the sentence is what paraphrasing is really about. This author has taken that sentence and has just messed with it, has just tried to manipulate that sentence to make it look different. Real paraphrasing isn't about manipulating the original sentence. It's about understanding what it means and expressing the ideas in those sentences in your own words. So a better attempt at paraphrasing would look like this. America, Kennedy states, will continue to wield influence on the world stage and to help people in countries around the world, but it will nevertheless be less important in a global sense than it is now. Now, that sentence contains all of the ideas from the original passage, but it expresses those ideas in a way that is not dependent upon the phrasing or structure of the original sentence. In fact, again, you'll see there are very few words that show up in both the original and the paraphrase here. But more importantly, there's also no phrasing or structure of the sentence that appears in both. So this is a much better way to paraphrase those sentences, because what the author has done here is expressed the ideas in a new way rather than trying to change the original sentence. I would point out the other thing that's positive here is that the author has included a reference to Kennedy. So we have America, Kennedy states, will continue to wield influence on the world stage, etc., etc. And that Kennedy states in the middle there isn't just about avoiding plagiarism, but it's about being clear with your audience about what's going on in this sentence. These are your words. If they weren't your words, they'd have to have quotation marks around them. But they're not your ideas. When you say something like Kennedy states, that clues in the reader that this is someone else's ideas that you are simply discussing. So this paraphrase is effective for several reasons. It is a new and original expression, and it's also very clear with the reader about where the ideas came from. In your summary, the first part of the summary and response assignment, this is the kind of thing I'd like to see. I'd rather you avoid quotation. I'd certainly like you to avoid quota phrasing or that middle ground between quotation and paraphrasing. I would rather you paraphrase and summarize Kennedy's ideas by putting them into your own words, but also reminding the audience that they're not your ideas, that they're ideas that come from the original source. With quoting, remember, the most important thing is that you quote accurately, that you get the wording, the phrasing exactly the way it was in the original. There are some other dangers of quotation which involve the quotations that don't fit the grammar of your sentence, for example. But by far the most common problem with quotation is simply inaccuracy, using quotations that do not say exactly what the source said. So when you're quoting, quote exactly. When you're paraphrasing, paraphrase completely. In other words, really come up with a new way of expressing these ideas. If you have any questions about this point, please let me know.